Today we're going to start Chapter 7, and in Chapter 7 we're going to learn how to store a bunch of data in a container. Now there are two containers that we'll learn about in this chapter, arrays and array lists. These are the sections from the book that we are going to be covering. So basically we're going to start with arrays first, and an array is basically a sequence of elements. It's kind of like a bucket that you can store information in, okay? And it's kind of like a list, and every item in the list has a position. So if I have a list of numbers, this is an array, but imagine it's a list of numbers. I can refer to them as, item at location 0, location 1, location 2, and so on up to location 8. So remember, in computer language, we start counting with zeros. Just like when I have a string, cat, and I want the first letter, I say I want the letter at position 0. I want char at 0. So the same with arrays. These arrays start counting from location 0, index 0. Now, when you're creating an array, you need to know what type of data you're going to store in the array. All the data in the array have to be the same type. So I can create an array of numbers like ints, or an array of floats, or an array of strings, or an array of booleans, or an array of objects. Like if I have a student object, I can create an array of students, but all the elements in the array have to have the same type. The array itself has a type. The type of that array is the type of the data, and then we put square brackets. So the way we indicate an array is by choosing the type of data inside, and then we put square brackets. And if we want to access any element in the array, any of these numbers, for example, we would access it using the position. So we access an item in the array by the name and the position. These are some examples of how to create an array. Now, to create an array, we need to know how many elements we are going to store in the array, because basically we're going to be going to RAM and requesting space that's big enough to fit all the elements in an array. So the first line here creates an array that is capable of storing 6 numbers, 6 ints. The second line is creating an array that is capable of storing 3 floats. The third one is capable of storing 5 strings. The last one is capable of storing 24 student objects. So the way you create an array is first you put the type. What's the type of the data for the array? Well, it's the type of the data followed by square brackets. And then you give a variable name and you use equal new, and you put the type again, and in square brackets, the size. So let's go create a couple together. So if I want to create some arrays, I can say, for example, int square bracket numbers equal new int, and let's put 3 numbers into this one. Let's create a string array. Let's say names equal to new string. Let's put 2 names in there. And then you can use anything, like let's say I can even have an array of booleans. So here I just created a bunch of arrays. They are all empty arrays at this point because I haven't put any data in them. Now, when you create arrays, if you don't put any data in them, automatically what happens for numbers is that zeros get put in. For objects and strings, we put null, and we're going to cover null more in depth in Java 2. But null is basically a keyword that indicates nothing is stored there. Now, if I want to access an element in the array so that I can put data into it or, print data, what I would do is I need 2 things. I need the name of my array and the location. Okay, so here, let's say this is an array that has some numbers in it. This is location 0, location 1, location 2, all the way up to location 7. If I say system.out.println x sub 2, it's going to go find location 2 in the array, and it's going to print it out. So I'm going to get 6 printed out. If I want to print out x sub 2 plus x sub 4, It's going to go find location 2, which is the 6. It's going to go find location 4, which is the 2.5. And then it's going to add them up to give me 8.5, and it's going to print that out. Now, what if I want to start putting information into the array? Well, first we create our array, and then we can use the name of the array and the index, the location, to put information in there. So here I created an array that has size 3, and I'm starting to put information. Remember, we start putting information with location 0. So I'm going to exams of 0 and putting a number, exams of 1, putting a number, exams of 2, putting a number. Now, what if I want to access this information so I can print it later? Again, I can access it by location, so I can print it exams of 0, exams of 1, exams of 2. Let's go try putting some data in our array. So first of all, if I say here system.out.println numbers of 0, when I created this numbers array, I didn't put anything in it. I just created an array of size 3. If I try printing numbers of 0 without me putting anything in it, I will get 0. So initially, arrays get populated with 0 for numbers. So this is why numbers of 0, sub-0 prints me a 0. Now, if I do that for names, here what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the same system.out.println names of 0 and system.out.println attendance of 0. So for numbers, we get zeros printed out. We're going to see for Booleans that we're going to get false printed out. So 0 is like false. Okay, so here it's 0 for numbers, null for strings and objects, and false for Booleans. Okay, so here I have an array that has nothing. Now, what if I want to put information in the array? So let's start putting information in it. So to put information in it, I have to know the location. So I can say, okay, at location 0, I'm going to put a 10. Location 1, I'm going to put a 8. And at location 2, I'm going to put a 9. Okay, so here my array has size 3. So I can put in 3 places, 0, 1, and 2. Now let's see what happens if I try accessing numbers of 3. Let's run this code and see what happens. I get an exception. Where is the exception coming from? It's coming from line 33. So it told me at line 33, you tried to do something illegal. What is the exception? It's array index out of bounds exception. You are trying to access a location in the array that's outside the boundary of the array because 3 is not a valid index because this array only has size 3. So it goes from 0 to 2. That's exactly the same as when I have a string, for example, cat, and I say, for example, system.out.println pet.char at 8. If I try accessing location 8 here, it's not going to let me. Okay, so this line is invalid. Let's just put a comment here, invalid index. This is also going to crash. It's going to throw an exception, and it's coming from line 36 in my code, and it crashes here because string index is out of range. This is a bad line too. This is invalid because index 8 is not valid. So when you're dealing with arrays, you can just think of them as a sequence of numbers, a sequence of objects, just like a string is a sequence of letters and characters. Okay, so I can only access location 0, 1, and 2. Let's say I want to print them after I put information in them. Let's try to print. Let's actually do it here. Okay, so let's come here and let's say I want to print the contents now of numbers. So I'll say system.out.println numbers of 0. Okay, and let's just copy that and modify it for 1 and 2. So I want to see if those numbers that I put in, 10, 8, and 9, if I'm going to be able to see them. And I'm able to see them. So I see 10, 9, 8, and 9 in my array. Okay, so you can store information in the array by index, and you can print it back by index. Now the question is, what if this array has 100 elements? Should I be, copying and pasting this code 100 times? Of course not. So remember here that the only difference between all these 3 lines is the index. So instead of printing the contents like this, I should use a for loop. Remember, a for loop lets us do something many, many times. Okay, so basically what I want to do is I want to do a system.out.println of numbers with some variable I. Now I want this I to start from 0 up to 2. So I can write a for loop that says, create me a variable I that starts with 0. I want to go as long as I'm less than 3, the size of the array. So if this array is size 3, I'm going to stop when I reach 3, and I'm going to go in increments of 1. And so this for loop will do the same as printing 3 times. It will print the elements in the array, location 0, location 1, location 2. When I reaches 3, it will stop. So you will find that with arrays, we use a lot of for loops. We're going to use for loops almost all the time to print the contents of the array. And so this is what we're doing here. When we want to print an array, we write a for loop. Now, a couple things to note is that when we start our index variable, we start from 0. We don't start from 1. Another thing you notice is that here we set index less than 3. We don't say less than or equal. So we don't equal the size, because the size, whatever the size is of the array, or the length of the array, the number of elements in the array, is not a valid index. Just like with a string, if I have the word cat, which is 3 letters, my valid indices are 0, 1, and 2. So we don't put an equal sign. We always use less than, and we put the length there. And if you try accessing an invalid index like I showed you, we would get an array index out of bounds exception. So sometimes you have an array and you know the length of the array because you created it. But maybe someone else has an array and they don't know how many elements are in the array. They don't know how it was created. So the nice thing about arrays is that they know their length. If you go to an array and you say .length, it will tell you how many elements are in this array. Now notice .length doesn't have parentheses after it. No parentheses. That means it is not a method. Okay, so I just want to kind of compare this with strings. If I have here, I have pet here, and I say system.out.println pet dot, and I start calling length. Length is a method. It has parentheses. Now the parentheses are empty because length is a method that doesn't take any parameters. Okay, so here, length of pet. Okay. Here I'm going to get the length, which is a method. But when we are dealing with arrays, if I go to numbers and I say numbers dot, here length is not a method. What is it? Does it remind you of anything when we were dealing with classes? It is a field. It is a field that is part of the array. And that field stores the length of the array. It tells me how many elements it was created with. So if I run this code, I will see that the same output will come. But I didn't have to remember that the array had size 3. I just basically went to the array and said, array, tell me your length. And it gave me back its length, which was 3. Now, sometimes, so now we solved the problem of printing the contents of the array. We don't have to print like 10 lines if the array has size 10. We just write one for loop. Now, what if I want to create an array and I want to just initialize it with some information? Instead of saying numbers of 0 equal, numbers of 1 equal, numbers of 2 equal, numbers of 3 equal, what you can do is create an initialization list. And an initialization list is basically a list of what you want to put in it using the curly braces. Now, there are two ways you can do it. You can just immediately put curly braces like this, or if you already had items in the array. So this is creating a new one. See, into square brackets, I'm creating a new array. If you already have an array created and you want to change its contents, you can by creating a new array, okay, new in square brackets, and then next to it, put the initialization list. So this is a slide that I want you to kind of print out or keep handy so that you can use this if you want to use an initialization list. Let's go and look at some examples. So here, the numbers array that I've created, if I wanted to change its contents, so I can then say, so here we're going to change the contents of numbers. So I'm going to say numbers equal to new int array, okay? And I'm going to give it a new array, like let's say 10, 30, 50, 70, 90. When I'm creating a new array, I'm creating a totally new array, I am not bound to the old size. So here I'm changing the contents and size of numbers. How can I make sure that it was changed? Well, what I can do is I can write a for loop that prints its contents. For int I equals 0, I less than numbers, length, I plus plus, and let's do a system.out.println numbers of I. Now, instead of printing them all on different lines, I'm going to print them on the same line. So I'm going to put numbers of I, and I'm going to add a space after. And let's just add here an empty line also, so we can differentiate what's going on. So now when I ran this code, it created a new array that has numbers 10, 30, 50, 70, 90, and I was able to print the contents of this array. Let's put a system.out here just to get a new line after it. So I got new content. Now, some of the arrays at the top that I created, like the string array, I didn't put anything in it. Well, I could, instead of saying equal to new string, what I could have done was said string names equal, and I could use an initialization list. Bob Builder Mini Mouse, for example. Okay. And again, if I wanted to print the contents of this array, I can use a for loop. So I can come here and say for int I 0, I less than names dot length, I plus plus. Again, dot out dot println names of I. Okay. And I have something wrong. What is it? The 4. And so now I should be able to see the names that are in my array. Okay, so here I used an initialization list to change the contents of an array. And at the top here, I used an initialization list to start off my array with some information. For example, like if I wanted to store the months, I'm not going to put them all, but let's say I wanted an array that has the name of the months. You know, I could just do that, January, February, you know, and so on. I'm just going to put dot, dot, dot here. Okay, so we could do that. And so an initialization list is very handy because now I can put all my information in one line instead of saying months of 0 equal January, months of 1 equal February, months of 2 equal March. So it's a quick way to get information into an array. Now, when you're creating the array, there are many ways that you could have done it. You could put the square brackets next to the data type, and this is the way that I prefer doing it because immediately when I look at the beginning of the line, it tells me that what I'm looking at, the variable that I'm going to be looking at after is an array. This is one way. You could also put the square brackets after the variable name. Both of these ways will work. So here, instead of creating attendance, like this, I could create another one, Boolean copy, for example, with square brackets after. So the square brackets can go after the array name or after the type. You can put them wherever you want. And this is a personal choice that you will choose. For me, I like looking at the beginning of the line and immediately identifying that names is an array. But some people like putting the square brackets after the name. That's a personal choice. Now, whatever you choose, you have to be careful. If I look at this line here, immediately I look at the beginning of the line and I see int square brackets. So I know that the variables that are being created on this line are all going to be arrays of integers. Numbers is an array of integers, codes is an array of integers, and scores is an array of integers. If you decide to put the square brackets after, then looking at this line, just by looking at the word int here, I cannot decide what each of these variables are. If I look at numbers, I see square brackets after it. So that means numbers is an array. If I look at codes, I see square brackets after it. That means codes is an array. But if I look the word scores, I don't see any square brackets. That means scores is an int. Okay, so the nice thing about the square brackets, putting them after the variable name, is that you can decide, you can create on the same line arrays and integers, for example. So that's one advantage for having the square brackets after the variable name. Now, one of the common things that we do with arrays is use for loops, like we said. So here, when I wanted to print the contents of my array, I used a for loop. Okay, all of the for loops look exactly the same. I create a variable. I started off with 0. I go until the array.length, so numbers.length, numbers.length, names.length, all of them I'm going up to the name of the array.length, and then I'm accessing by location, by I. There's another for loop called the for each loop, or the enhanced for loop. And what this for loop does is that it looks at the contents of the array. It doesn't look at the indices. So I that we've been using here is the index. We're looking at the index. We're changing the index from 0 until the length. But this for each loop looks at the contents of the array. So you need to know the type of the data that is in the array. Let's look at some examples. Here I have an array of numbers. It's an int array. So if it's an int array, that means the contents of this array are all ints. So the for each loop says, I want to look at every int inside this array. I'm just going to call it n, for example. So you create a variable that points to the elements that has the same type, and the colon says in, and then the array name, numbers. So this is saying for every int called n in numbers, what do I want to do? I want to print n. I want to print that value. So n is going to start by looking at the 3, and then n is going to be the 4, and then n is going to be the 5. And so when I say value here, it's going to print me the 3, the 4, the 5. Let's look at another example. Here I have an array of doubles. So I have some doubles in there. Because this is an array of doubles, I'm going to say for every double in the array. So I create a variable that is double. So here the variable that I'm creating, int, is matching the type int. Here the variable double that I'm creating is matching the double here. And then num is a variable name that you choose. It could be x, could be number, could be cat, could be any variable name that you want. Colon, and then the name of the array. My name of the array here is nums, so I put nums. And what is it that I want to print? I want to print the variable. So this will print me 3.0, 9.0, 18.0. If I have an array of strings, so here I have an array of strings that has Tweety, Minnie, and Papai. Okay, so my array is an array of strings. That means I'm going to look at every string in this array. So here the type is string. The type here is also string. I give it a name. Let's call it S. In What's my array name? It's names. So for every string in names, what do I want to do? I want to print it. And so here, the for each works by looking at the content of the array. I don't have to worry about starting at location. I don't have to worry about stopping when I reach the length. It knows that it needs to go through every element in the array. Let's try it out. So here, if I wanted to print the array names again, so let's just add a comment so we know what we're doing. Using for each. Okay. I look at names and I say, oh, names is an array of strings. So I'm going to write a for loop that looks at every string in names. Okay. And what is it that I want to do? I want to print that string that is inside names. Okay, so that variable that I created here s, this is what I'm printing. So it should print me the contents of the array. Again, the four names. Let's try it with the numbers array that we have here. Again, let's copy this line. I'm printing numbers. Numbers is an array of ints, so that means my for loop is going to have int. Call it anything. Let's call it x. What's the name of the array that I want to print the contents of? It's numbers. And so here I'm going to say I want you to print me x. So x is referring to every number in the array numbers. And so I get those numbers printed. And so it depends. If your array was a float, this would be float. If it was an array of doubles, this would be double. If it's an array of students, it would be student. Whatever the type of the data is, you would put that here. Now, a small note about the for each loop. With the regular for loop, okay? So here, what I'm doing is I'm just printing the contents. Change the contents also, okay? So I'm going to come here, and after printing it out, I'm going to make everything 10 more than it was, okay? So numbers of I plus equal 10. So I'm modifying whatever is in the array by adding 10 to it, okay? Now let's actually add it first, modify it first, and then print. So we see the contents of the array being changed. Okay, so it used to be 10, 30, 50. Now the contents of the array, when I tried printing them, and I'm printing them here at the end, I'm seeing 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. So I see that they got modified. Okay, now what I'm going to do here, I'm going to actually try doing the same by saying x plus equal 10. Now when I do that and I print the contents, it seems like things got printed, got incremented, right? It used to be 20, now it's 30. However, if I just copy this loop again to print it a second time, okay, so let's print a second time to see if x plus equal 10 took effect and changed the array. Okay, so I'm not going to modify it, but I'm going to try to print the contents of the array. Here, it shows me the contents are 30, 50. But when I print it a second time, I'm seeing the numbers 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. I'm not seeing the 30, 50, 70. Why? The reason is over here, what I did was I created a new variable x. And so in RAM, x got the values that were in the array. Here, what I'm changing is I'm changing the variable x. So let's kind of look at what's happening underneath the hood. So initially, I had my numbers. Let's go up to where we created numbers. It had 10, 30, 50, 70, 90. So my array had 10, 30, 50, 70, 90. Okay, so that's where I created the array at the beginning. And then what I wanted to do here, this loop will add 10 to each element. So what I did here was I wrote a for loop that said start with location I, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and go to numbers of 0 and add 10 to it. So it went to this and it added 10 to it. And I said plus equal. That means I'm changing it. It's 20. And the 30 became 40. And the 50 became 60. And the 70 became 80. And the 90 became 100. Okay, so here this line actually changed the array. Okay, so this line changed the array content. And then I wanted to print it. Okay, so I printed it out and I see that it was changed. Now here, when I tried saying printing numbers using for each, let's go to where that is. Okay, so over here, I'm trying to print the content. So here, what this does, it creates a variable int x. So I have a variable x in RAM, and what it does, it copies down the values. So it says I need to look at every variable, every number in numbers. What's the first number? It's 20. So the 20 gets copied in here, 20. There we go, got copied into x. So we say x plus equal 10. So this 20 now got added 10 to it. It became 30. And then I said print me x. So I saw the 30 getting printed. And then after it's done, it goes and says the 40. Let's copy the 40. So the 40 gets copied and we have now inside of it 40. Again, we say 40 x plus equal 10. So the 40 becomes a 50. And we print it out and we see 50. So for us, it seems like the array is changing. However, after we're done with the 30, 50, 70, 90, 110, when I come here to print the second time, the array the second time, and it starts printing, it's going to go back to the original array. The original array still has 20, 40, 60, 80, 100. It hasn't been changed. What was being changed here? The variable x. So here, contents of array are not changing. We are changing a copy of the data in X. Okay, so that is what we're doing. So the for each is nice. Okay, it's nice for printing. However, you cannot make modifications to your array using this enhanced for loop or this for each loop. You can only make changes if you use the regular for loop. Okay, so if you want to make changes, you have to use the regular for loop. But for printing out information, it's just easy. You don't have to say x.length, numbers.length. You can just use this loop.